Amber stood frozen in front of the slightly ajar living room door, her eyes drawn to something glinting on the carpeted floor. A delicate gold bracelet, unfamiliar and out of place, lay discarded on the expensive rug. She frowned. The bracelet wasn't hers, and it certainly didn't belong to Michael, her husband, who had just informed her he'd be away on a business trip for a few days. But what unsettled her more was that she had cleaned this very room earlier in the day, and it hadn't been there then. Instinct told Amber something was wrong. The house was always deathly quiet when Michael was away, an oppressive silence that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. But now it felt as though the stillness had been invaded by an invisible presence, something or someone lurking just beyond her awareness. "Is anyone here?" she called out, her voice cutting through the stillness, trying to dispel the suffocating quiet. No answer. Only the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, distant and monotonous, stretched time unbearably thin. Amber bent down and picked up the bracelet, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. A chill ran down her spine. Then suddenly she heard it. A faint sound. It wasn't coming from the living room, but from the hallway behind her. Footsteps soft but deliberate, as though someone was trying to move without being detected. Her heart pounded against her rib cage, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was in the house, but how? She had locked all the doors after Michael left. Amber spun around, her gaze darting toward the hallway, but it was empty. A cold draft seeped through a partially open window, stirring the curtains into a lazy dance. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that the loneliness of the house was playing tricks on her mind. But then from the shadowed corner of the hallway, a voice emerged, low, smooth, and laced with a faint hint of mockery. "Looking for something, Amber?" She whipped around, her heart nearly stopping at the sight of Ryan, Michael's son, leaning casually against the doorway, dressed in a black t-shirt and dark jeans. His piercing gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that suggested he had been watching her for some time. "Ryan," she gasped, her voice hoarse with shock. When did you get here?" Ryan's lips curved into a faint sardonic smile, one that made it impossible for her to read his thoughts. "Yesterday. Didn't Michael tell you?" Amber swallowed hard. No, Michael hadn't mentioned that Ryan would be coming home. The unexpected appearance of her stepson, coupled with the mysterious bracelet and the charged atmosphere in the house, made her feel as though she had stumbled into a narrative she didn't fully understand. "This bracelet," she began, struggling to keep her voice steady as she held it up for him to see. "Is it yours?" Ryan glanced at the bracelet, his eyes darkening momentarily before he let out a quiet chuckle. "No, but it looks like you've stumbled onto something interesting, haven't you?" Amber wanted to press him further, to unravel the threads of whatever was happening, but the cold, enigmatic look in Ryan's eyes rendered her speechless. In that moment, she realized something undeniable. This house, which had once been her sanctuary, no longer felt safe. Amber tightened her grip on the bracelet as she walked back to her bedroom. Ryan had already disappeared toward the staircase, and she struggled to steady her breath, though her mind remained in turmoil. This house, with its pristine white walls and dazzling crystal chandeliers, could not conceal the memories she had tried so hard to bury. Amber had not always been the woman she was now. Before she met Michael, she had been entirely different. Strong, ambitious, and fiercely independent, working in the fast-paced world of media with a demanding schedule and endless important meetings. She once believed she could have it all: career, love, and a fulfilling personal life. But everything changed after the end of her first, deeply passionate relationship with a man who left her shattered. That divorce didn't just rob her of trust and love. It left behind an emptiness that no amount of success could fill. Michael had come into her life at a time when Amber had given up on happiness. He was wealthy, composed, and offered her something she hadn't experienced in years. A promise of safety, of stability, of a life where she no longer had to struggle alone. Amber hadn't fallen in love with Michael right away, but there was a comfort in his presence, like settling into a familiar room where nothing could unexpectedly fall apart. So she said yes, convincing herself that this calm, predictable existence would be enough to heal the scars she carried. But Amber hadn't anticipated the loneliness. Michael, for all his outward perfection, had never been a man who prioritized his family. He buried himself in projects, long business trips, and endless meetings with clients. The house he had built wasn't a home. It was a grand stage where Amber played the role of the perfect wife for the world to see. Empty dinners, perfunctory conversations, and nights spent alone in a vast, silent bedroom made her feel less like a partner and more like an ornamental piece in Michael's curated life. And then Ryan arrived. Ryan was Michael's son from a previous marriage, a woman Amber had never met, but whose presence loomed over this house like an unspoken shadow. Michael rarely spoke of his ex-wife or their past, yet Amber felt her presence in everything, as though the ghost of her existence still lingered. Ryan was the clearest embodiment of that past Michael wanted to hide. He had grown up amid arguments and instability, something reflected in the way he looked at the world with skepticism and detachment. Amber recalled the first time she met Ryan. He had been 18 then, freshly graduated from high school. The young man with tousled black hair and piercing eyes had made her uncomfortable from the moment she saw him. It wasn't because of any rudeness on his part, but because of the way he looked at her like she was an intruder, someone who didn't belong in his family. Years passed and Ryan left for college, and Amber thought she had escaped that piercing gaze forever. But now he was back, and not just as a young man anymore. Ryan had grown, not only in his appearance but in his demeanor. There was a quiet, enigmatic confidence about him, something Amber couldn't put into words, and that very confidence unsettled her. Her thoughts drifted back to the bracelet in her hand. Who did it belong to? Had Ryan brought it from somewhere? Or was it connected to someone she didn't know? The questions churned in her mind, but more than anything, the object stirred an unsettling feeling within her. A sense that perhaps she didn't truly know what was happening in this house. Amber let herself fall onto the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. This house felt like a locked box, its secrets beginning to surface, slow and inevitable. But the most terrifying truth wasn't about Michael or Ryan. It was the realization that she was losing control, not of the house but of herself. Amber couldn't stop thinking about the way Ryan had looked at her when he mentioned the bracelet. It wasn't the look of a boy or a son. It was cold, confident, and challenging. The confusion and unease in her heart grew steadily stronger. She couldn't understand why Ryan's presence stirred such a whirlwind of emotions within her. A feeling she hadn't confronted since entering this marriage. But no matter how many times she tried to push the question aside, it haunted her like a persistent shadow. That evening, the house once again descended into silence. Michael still hadn't returned, and as usual, he hadn't called. Amber sat in the living room, her eyes fixed on the television screen, though she wasn't paying attention to the movie playing. The bracelet lay on the table before her, a silent reminder that she needed answers, but from whom? Ryan or herself? Soft footsteps sounded behind her. Amber didn't need to turn to know it was Ryan. Perhaps the silence of the house made every small movement amplified. Or maybe Ryan had become such an integral part of the heavy atmosphere that his presence was unmistakable. He stepped into the living room, holding a glass of water, and sat down on the sofa opposite her. The dim glow of the lamp cast shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp features of the young man he had become. "Can't sleep?" His voice broke the stillness, low and calm, yet carrying an undercurrent of something that unsettled her. Amber startled slightly at his sudden attempt to start a conversation. He never initiated one with her before. "No," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What about you? It's late. Why aren't you resting?" Ryan shrugged slightly and set his glass on the table. "Maybe it's this house. It's too quiet. It makes me uncomfortable." Amber couldn't help but agree. The silence in this house wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that felt like a storm brewing beneath the surface. She looked at Ryan, searching his eyes for something, an explanation, a hint, anything that might help her understand the strange discomfort growing inside her. But his gaze met hers unwaveringly, without hesitation or fear. "That bracelet," Ryan said suddenly, his eyes flicking toward the object on the table. "You're still holding on to it." Amber felt her heartbeat slow, the tension mounting in her chest. She tried to maintain an air of calm. "I think it might belong to someone. Are you sure you don't know anything about it?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and then placed it back down. A faint smirk crossed his face, one that made Amber feel as though she'd just stepped into a trap she couldn't see. "If I told you it wasn't mine, would you believe me?" His voice was soft, but there was an edge of provocation in it that Amber couldn't ignore. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. The silence between them stretched, and Amber felt herself being pulled into Ryan's gaze. A gaze that seemed to dominate the entire room. She wanted to break the tension, to say something, but before she could, Ryan stood up and moved closer to her. "I think," he said slowly, bending down to pick up the bracelet from the table. His fingers turned it over, the small object seeming to carry a weight far beyond its size. "You should be careful about the things you choose to hold on to, Amber. Sometimes the smallest things can change everything." His words cut through the air like a blade, leaving Amber frozen in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Ryan walked away, his figure disappearing into the hallway, but his words echoed in her mind. She didn't know if he had been talking about the bracelet or something else entirely. The house sank back into silence, but this time it was no longer the deathly quiet she had grown used to. It carried a sense of anticipation, as though something had only just begun. Amber reached for the glass of wine on the table, taking a large sip, but the burning liquid did little to ease the unease gnawing at her. And for the first time she wondered, was she truly in control of this situation, or had she already been pulled into Ryan's game? Amber couldn't sleep. The bracelet, Ryan's piercing gaze, and the veiled words he had spoken replayed in her mind like a never-ending melody. She sat upright in bed, the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting soft, ghostly shadows across the room. The unease inside her swelled as though the house itself held secrets she wasn't yet ready to uncover. She tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that Ryan's presence posed no threat. But deep down, she knew something was shifting, not just in him but in her as well. Descending the stairs, Amber noticed the living room lights were still on. She paused midway down the staircase and looked toward the sofa where Ryan sat, a glass of wine in his hand, staring into the distance. In that moment, he no longer appeared to be the cold, detached young man she had come to know. He looked like someone burdened by unseen pain, wrestling with an inner turmoil she had never glimpsed before. Amber felt a strange sensation stir within her, an emotion that shouldn't exist yet grew stronger with every passing second. A pull she couldn't deny, no matter how much she wanted to. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. Ryan turned his head to look at her, his gaze sweeping over her, as if he were weighing her presence, calculating her thoughts. "What about you?" he replied, his tone low and deliberate, laced with a faint challenge. "Something keeping you awake?" Amber stepped further down, moving slowly toward the sofa, careful to keep a measured distance between them. "Maybe it's the silence," she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed the tension rising inside her. "This house always makes me feel alone." Ryan let out a dry chuckle, a sound layered with meaning she couldn't quite decipher. "Alone? You have no reason to feel alone. You have everything. Money, status, a perfect husband. Everyone out there would kill to have a life like yours." Amber frowned, sensing the bite in his words, but also an unsettling truth. "Do you really think everything is perfect?" she asked, meeting his gaze head-on. "You don't know anything, Ryan. This life, it's not what you think." Ryan stood, setting his glass on the table before walking toward her. His expression grew serious, his eyes darkening, as though he were searching her soul for answers. "Then tell me, Amber," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent shivers through her. "What makes you so unhappy? Is it Michael or is it you?" His question sliced through her like a blade, exposing the thoughts and feelings she had tried so hard to bury. She turned her face away, unwilling to respond. But Ryan wasn't letting her off so easily. He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing to mere inches. "Have you ever wondered," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent shivers through her, "what it is you're really looking for?" Amber didn't answer. She couldn't. The air between them felt thick, suffocating, as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving only the two of them trapped in a web of emotions neither could deny. Her heart raced, her breath shallow and quick, and as she looked up her eyes met his, intense, penetrating, and dangerous. Ryan leaned in slightly, his face just inches from hers. "You know what's happening here, don't you?" he murmured, his voice a chilling breeze against her ear. "We both know." Amber took a step back, but her foot hit the edge of the coffee table, halting her retreat. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't. Or you don't want to?" He interrupted, his eyes blazing. His words struck her like a thunderclap, leaving her breathless. Amber felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from a plunge that would shatter everything. Yet instead of fear, she felt an inexplicable rush, a forbidden thrill she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, if ever. And then, before she could stop herself, Ryan reached out and cupped her face. His touch was gentle yet firm, the warmth of his hand spreading through her body, washing away every shred of logic and restraint. Amber didn't know who moved first, but in the next moment, their lips met in a kiss. Fierce, raw, and charged with the intensity of emotions they had both suppressed for far too long. The world around them vanished. All Amber could feel was Ryan. His breath, his closeness, the way he seemed to ignite something inside her that she hadn't realized was missing. But even as the kiss ended, and their lips parted, both of them knew there was no going back. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. Amber stepped back, her hand covering her mouth, as though to erase the evidence of what had just happened. "We shouldn't have done that," she whispered. But her voice lacked the conviction she had hoped for. Ryan didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his gaze unwavering, silently communicating that this wasn't over. Amber turned and walked away, but she could still feel his eyes on her, sending shivers down her spine. She knew in that moment that nothing in this house would ever be the same again. Amber hurried out of the living room, her breath rapid, her chest feeling like it was about to explode. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare meet Ryan's gaze again. Her legs carried her to the bedroom, where the heavy door closed behind her with a decisive click. She leaned against it, her trembling hands covering her flushed face. The sensation of his lips still lingered on hers, the taste of their forbidden kiss unshakable. The realization that she had crossed a line felt like free-falling into an abyss. She walked over to the mirror, staring at the woman reflected back at her. That woman was no longer the Amber she once knew. Her eyes were clouded, filled with panic and guilt, screaming to be acknowledged. Yet buried deep within those emotions was something small but undeniable. A flicker of exhilaration, a feeling she refused to admit to herself. Amber shook her head, trying to dispel the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind, but it was futile. Ryan had imprinted himself onto her consciousness, and no matter how much she wanted to escape it, she couldn't erase the moment. The next morning, Amber woke with a start. She glanced out the window as the bright morning sun filtered through the curtains, making her squint. The world outside seemed unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But inside this house, everything was different. She could feel it as soon as she stepped out of her room. The air seemed heavier, each footstep echoing ominously in the tense silence. Ryan was already in the kitchen. He wore a simple t-shirt, sipping his coffee, his eyes fixed on his phone. But as Amber entered, he looked up, and their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched on, feeling far longer than it was, as though time itself had frozen. Amber's cheeks burned, and she quickly turned away, pretending to pour herself a glass of water to avoid facing him. "Did you sleep well?" Ryan's voice broke the silence, calm and measured, yet it sent a chill through her. Amber stiffened, but didn't turn around. "I did," she replied, trying to keep her tone even. "What about you?" Ryan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rose, carrying his empty coffee cup to the sink. The distance between them shrank with each step he took, and Amber felt her nerves tighten with every second. He stopped directly behind her, his breath warm against the back of her neck, freezing her in place. "I think," Ryan said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "we both know this won't stop here." Amber spun around, her eyes wide with alarm. "Ryan, no. This was a mistake. It won't happen again." Her voice trembled, but she tried to inject firmness into her words, hoping it would mask her unease. Ryan stared at her, his gaze unwavering. "A mistake?" he echoed, his lips curling into a faint knowing smile. "If it was a mistake, then why didn't you push me away last night? Why didn't you run the moment it started?" Amber couldn't answer. She couldn't, because his words pierced straight through to the truth she was too afraid to face. But before she could process what he had said, Ryan stepped back, leaving the kitchen without another word. She stood there, feeling adrift and overwhelmed, unable to move. That day, Amber stayed in her room, attempting to bury herself in work, books, anything that could fill the void in her mind. But nothing worked. Ryan's image haunted her. His eyes, his voice, the memory of their kiss replaying over and over. Amber realized she wasn't just trapped in this house. She was trapped within herself. A few days later, Michael returned. The atmosphere of the house shifted immediately, the unsettling quiet giving way to the facade of normalcy. Michael and Ryan spoke easily, like father and son, catching up after time apart, while Amber forced herself to act as though nothing had changed. But every time her eyes met Ryan's, the unspoken truth between them loomed heavy, a secret they both carried in silence. On Ryan's last night before leaving, Amber stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the backyard. The dim glow of the garden lights illuminated Ryan's figure as he stood motionless in the cool night air, as though waiting for something or someone. Amber knew she shouldn't, but her feet moved on their own, taking her down the stairs, each step deliberate, leading her to him. "Amber," Ryan said, his voice steady as she stopped a few steps away. "You can't keep denying this." Amber didn't reply. She stood there, feeling the night's chill seep into her skin. And in that moment, she understood that her life had irreversibly changed. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. The story between her and Ryan wasn't over. It had only just begun.